Welcome to our podcast. Let's Make History Together is dedicated to Springfield, Ohio. We are a coalition of community members who are actively shaping a new, bold vision for our city. We are doing so through an initiative called Springfield 2051.
Welcome to the Let's Make History Together podcast series. I'm Kevin Rose, a community historian, and in this series we're going to be looking at the pillars that have come out as the Springfield 2051 process. And specifically today we're going to be looking at a key pillar in that process, activating Southside Revitalization. So I'm thrilled today to be joined by David Beurle, the founder of Future IQ, who served as our lead consultant throughout this process. And also with Karlos Marshall, who's the co-founder and co-executive director of the Conscious Connect, an organization that is doing just extraordinary work across Springfield, the whole community, but especially in the South Side, working on youth development and recreation, just a lot of great work. So thank you, both of you, for joining me today. We'll dive into the questions if that works. So David, I'll start with you. In your work, we've had a lot of listening sessions, talking to people all across this community, and activating Southside Revitalization emerged as one of those 7 pillars. And it was quite clear, and it wasn't just in meetings on the South Side that this was important, but people talked about it across the entire community. Why do you think that the community was saying that this was such a high priority?
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, so a little bit of context to that, right? So we've had about 2,000 people so far weigh in on input into the Springfield 2051 process, and that's through surveys, listening sessions, think tanks, and so on. And what has been a really consistent and recurrent thread through that input is about social fabric and people wanting to have a unified, healthy community. And when people talk about that, they start to recognise, I think the honest part is they recognise that there are deep inequities, historical inequities and divisions that have been in this community. And a lot of that is race-based and is very historical. I don't think it's current. I don't think there's a kind of a big sort of fault line currently, but there is an historic fault line. And people have recognised that if we're going to have Springfield 2051 as a united, healthy, prosperous community, we have to deal with some of those issues. So, and people point to, particularly young people, have pointed to the South Side as someone has been left behind historically. So why it's been elevated to a pillar is because the input we've received and then the deliberations of the steering committee have highlighted that this is a really important topic. If we don't deal with this in the process of going forward, then we're really going to handicap our progress at the level of the whole community. So I think it's really interesting and healthy that this is elevated to a key focus area, a strategic pillar. And I think there's a lot of good ideas starting to emerge about what could happen in that area. And certainly people have been identifying priorities. But I do think this is, at the core of it, people have recognised that there needs to be a correction or an addressing or a deliberate focus and an intention on elevating a key part of this community that has been left behind for a long time. And that there's an opportunity here to do something that changes that course.
Yeah, and I do want to get back some to those inequities a little bit later, but first I want to pivot to Karlos, because again you've been so active on the South Side. When we use the word revitalize, right, revitalize this neighborhood, what do you think success looks like for the South Side of Springfield?
Yeah, I would say that success looks like it does in any other thriving neighborhood and community across the country. First and foremost, we also have to understand that the issue that we're facing in the South Side of Springfield in relation to the rest of the city is not something that's unique to this city either. You know, with the Conscious Connect, we do a ton of work in Dayton, and we see those similar disparities across East and West Dayton. So there are best practices and blueprints just in neighboring counties and region that we can point to see how we can make more prosperous neighborhoods and communities. What success looks like is having access, equal and equitable access to opportunities, whether that's recreational opportunities, small business development opportunities, workforce development, recreational environmental issues. There are also a ton of environmental issues facing the South Side, as we know, Springfield being a Rust Belt city and community, and the legacies and scars that industries and factories and plants have left behind. So just making sure that everybody has the resources and tools and opportunities to obtain and aspire to become the best versions of themselves. And, we have to do that through a multitude of approaches, through policies, resources, public-private partnerships, but also addressing these deeply problematic systemic barriers that David has alluded to within our community. And those things take time, and it will take coalition building, working across the proverbial aisle. And what we know is that processes like this, progress only moves at the speed of trust. So that's what we need to continue focusing on in the immediate future is trust building.
Yeah, it's as a historian, a community historian, that's actually how we met. There was a documentary on redlining. And when we look at the antecedents of what has led the South Side into these situations, as a young college student, when I first moved here, and you see these neighborhoods, you're like, oh, what? People aren't taking care of the properties. Things are run down, right? There's a lot of vacant properties. And then you start studying these things, right? You look into redlining, you look into the history of legalized segregation. And by that, I mean where segregation is written into the law, which these things had their antecedents here in Springfield. I mean, Springfield was I hate to use the word leader in this field, right? Because it doesn't feel like a leading thing, but a city that was really pushing a lot of these policies. And then you see their effects on the environment, right? There's no red line on the ground, but you can see them, right? You look across to the other side of the street and you see just larger levels of decline than you do on the other side of the street. So these things have come up quite a bit in these sessions. And how do we address these legacies and acknowledge in a way these legacies while trying to also build forward as a community? Because it's something that we've seen in these sessions. I think we need to talk about these issues. As a historian, I want to talk about history all the time, but we also then need to be talking about the future and how we do that. How do we balance those two things, do you think, Karlos, in here in Springfield?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. And quite honestly, it's more of an art than it is a science. It certainly comes with particular challenges, but I think the main things of how you begin to address them is by leaning in, which is precisely what we're doing with the 2051 project by standing up revitalization of the South Side as a specific pillar and elevating and acknowledging that there's some real systemic issues and barriers that need to be addressed here from a generational perspective. We've heard through the multiple listening sessions that we've had with the Southside exchanges, people bringing up these issues irrespective of their age. And so you also have elders in the community that ask, well, what's the difference between this specific project from the project that they heard about 3 decades ago that did not bear any fruits of their labor and their advocacy? So that's really important to continue to have those conversations with the community moving forward.
Yeah, and we had that as we were looking to people to help guide this process and steer it. My wife and I called different people, and I was not even aware of the number of projects where promises had been made. I knew of some of them, but I'm talking over the last 20 years, 30 years, where there were different things that happened, and it really came to light. And part of this process is, David, going through a lot of the work that's happened in the past, figuring out where there maybe have been shortcomings, but also trying to figure out what led to those, right? And some of them I know are communication. So what do you think in terms of communication, how this project can be different on communicating the results out?
So I think what's really important in Springfield 2051 is that there's a very concerted effort to make it inclusive and a big tent, to bring a lot of players together. And because this is not being run by an entity like a government, like a county or a city, this is really a coalition of players, and that's a little unusual. I mean, there have been a lot of really good efforts here before, but this one is a little bigger in scale because it is bringing together county, city, and a lot of institutions, foundations, organisations, like Karlos's organisation and so on. An unusual collaboration. And I think in today's world, what that offers is grander thinking and the potential for bigger solutions. So, as you pointed to, Karlos, there's been efforts and conversations that never delivered materially on the ground. A bigger community conversations potentially can bring more resources to the table and get different players coming together. Because I think what this may be different, Kevin, and perhaps as an historian you could judge this better, but I think what's different in Springfield 2051 is that it has elevated Southside as a pillar from the whole community, not Southside as an important topic area for the people or from the people in Southside. This is a recognition at the whole community level that this particular area of the community is worthy and needing particular different attention. And I think that elevates it and gives it a higher priority. I mean, we have yet to go through the process of developing actions and prioritizing those, but I am sure that there'll be something that comes out that will be recognised as a community-wide high priority. Couple of little caveats, if I could add, though, is I think what we have to do at the level of communication, we have to be very careful about managing expectations, because systemic changes do take time to correct. And if we're going to talk about revitalising a neighbourhood of the scale of Southside, we're talking multi-million dollar, multi-year processes. So there are no quick fixes on this, or else they probably would have been done, right? But I do think this is about coming up with some of those original systemic solutions, looking at best practice. Karlos, you mentioned that in other locations. But I also think we have to navigate a line here very carefully, because we've heard from people in the Southside community. I mean, they are very deeply rooted in that neighbourhood. I mean, some of those families are multi-generation families. I mean, they really belong. I mean, there's a huge sense of belonging. The danger sometimes in this case with revitalisation is you can also get gentrification, and that can displace local people, right? So I do think there has to be some really considered and mature thought about how do we navigate this process going forward to elevate that neighbourhood and assist those families and help young people find career paths and future pathways, but at the same time preserve the integrity of that neighbourhood and the people who have made that their home for so many decades and generations. But I do think there are projects that will surface that will really hit on that sweet spot, right? But I think that's why Springfield 2051 is a different process, because it's a long 12+ month planning process. It's very deep engagement, but also I'm seeing people thinking very deeply and thoughtfully and carefully about both priorities, but then how do we execute that so we don't create unintended consequences.
And one of those things that can help lessen the worry of gentrification is home ownership. And it's not the end all, right? We see a lot of regions across the country that have seen such massive levels of growth that taxes become unaffordable. But in a community like Springfield, home ownership can be the key to kind of create, obviously, ownership within the neighborhood, even outside of the house, maintenance of properties versus, say, rentals. And Karlos, we've been in discussions recently because there's a project coming into our community that is a lot of rentals. And we also need a balance, right? We also want outside investment. But we've seen a lot of outside groups coming in, but we've not seen a lot of local groups building housing, and specifically building housing for ownership. What do you think we can be doing to try to promote more ownership on the south side of Springfield?
Absolutely. I think it's certainly a challenge, but I think it starts with centering local voices of residents. Again, it is a challenge when you're talking about a geographical area that has experienced and subjected redlining, but I think it's also important that we contextualize redlining as not just a past practice, but something that we continue to experience and advance the solutions to it. We're continuously experiencing the remnants of it. When you're talking about these projects in terms of affordable housing, long-term permanent rentals, right? That's a result of land availability. Right, that's why these projects are occurring on the south side. Well, the land is available as a direct result of redlining, right? Of why we have vacant lots, of why we have properties that have been dilapidated, have not been restored, why we have a multitude of properties that are in the arrears related to taxes. That's why these properties are available. So it becomes extremely problematic when land availability becomes a justification to continuously concentrate those type of projects in those neighborhoods, because in essence, in reality, you're continuing to perpetuate the legacy that is redlining. Now, again, want to be acutely attentive and aware and conscious of the fact that we do have families out there that are unhoused or underhoused, and we're not just talking about somebody that's living literally on the street. We're talking about families that are going from place to place and trying to have shelter. So we also fundamentally understand that. But the South Side has also carried the historical burden for the city and the county within that regard. So I think that's what you're hearing people say is, why do we have to continue to carry the burden when, majority of our city, probably, if you look at some data, more than half of our city is our rental properties. And so even more so, if you're looking at the South Side specifically, right? People are also concerned about the new proposed location of the jail being on the opposite side of 70, but still being on the southern end of town, right? So I think that becomes the concern: is why does this continue to be a proverbial dumping ground for these type of projects that, in the minds of some, bring undesirable consequences? So we have to find that mix and that balance, as David is alluding to, of home ownership, affordable housing, but in the end, what we need to be striving for is mixed income communities. Low income projects produce low income neighborhood street level solutions that these outside developers, in the end, don't have to face the realities of what they produce. And again, that's the difference between intentions and impact.
Yeah. So we maybe have spoken about this before, but that was my own experience in Springfield. When I graduated from college, I wanted to invest and buy a property, and I looked on the South Side. And I looked on the South Side because, one, there were affordable properties, but it was also within walking distance of downtown. You could walk to restaurants. You could walk to I'm a historian, right? You could walk to the archives. I could walk to my office. It had this livability that I was looking for, and I found a house that was vacant for 20 years. And I was looking at several houses first, and I went to view with a realtor that I'll say is not in Springfield anymore. So this isn't someone we can try to track down. But I went to look at that house, and he was like, this isn't your neighborhood. This isn't where your people live. And I was like, what do you mean? One of my best friends lives next door. And the entire language that was out there, I didn't realize these things existed, right? And it wasn't the redlining that existed in the 1930s. It was this informal, let me show you properties up on the north side. Let me show you, it's a better investment, a better spot for you to invest your money. And I was like, I think this is a great spot to invest my money. And we've been living on the South Side for 20 plus years. And I hope those things are lessening. But you talk to people and some of that's out there. And we're never going to create policies that are just going to solve all this, right? You're always going to have some of this stuff that's lingering in the background. But it's what can we be doing to try to find people that want to invest in these neighborhoods and make sure that we remove any of those barriers for that. So
Kevin, if I could add to that too, because
Please.
if I sort of back it up and just put this in a broader context, is that I think the winds of change, or the trends, are actually very supportive of Southside and Southside revitalization. Because if you look at most urban sort of centres in this country, what's happened over time is you had these, vibrant downtown cores, you had these sort of first ring of neighbourhoods, right? And then, obviously, over decades, we got that sort of suburban flight mode going on. And a lot of those inner suburbs have been impoverished or have been sort of run down in many, many cities in this country, right? But the macro trends at the moment, and you're sort of a bit ahead of those trends, is people are looking for that return to that walkability and that celebration of those neighbourhoods and so on. So I think people are looking for the revitalisation of those neighbourhoods sort of more geographically, as well as obviously in Springfield, right? So I think that's a tailwind. But again, I think there's also this really important historical component about Southside and what it represents, right? And so when we talk about revitalising Southside, this is my opinion, right? So I'm the outsider, right?
Yeah.
So take it for that, right? Is I do think that's part of that deep kind of history here. You think of the Gammon House and you think of those type of facilities and the character and so I think that as we think about that, I think that's an opportunity to elevate that story as well. So one of the, for example, we've been starting to talk about projects of how could you implement on these strategic focus areas. And people have been talking about the entrance corridors or into Springfield, into the downtown, and the one that runs through Southside coming from the interstate straight north. I mean, obviously that's one that, could do with a refresh, right? But it's also a chance to to tell a story about Southside and about that history and to celebrate that, not to modernise it or kind of obliterate it, but somehow or other do some really sensitive, smart sort of redevelopment or reinvigoration of that sort of corridor. And obviously that's then connecting important components in this community. As you move out from the downtown, you've got the STEM Academy and you've got this neighbourhood. There's a way, if you kind of imagine, like just let yourself imagine kind of what the future could look like, I think there's a real chance to have projects like that emerge that have all sorts of big impacts across multiple dimensions, not only just the appeal and the presentation, but the sense of pride that people have in those adjacent areas, the relevance of Southside as a neighbourhood, the livability, all those components. So I do think that there are some macro trends that it could be very encouraging and supportive for this topic area.
Yeah. So one of the things with revitalization in neighborhoods is obviously just everyday living. We've been talking about your house and home ownership and these types of things. But again, as a resident on the South Side for 20 years, we evolve, right? We fix up our house, or much of our house, still not finished. And then you have children and you look for playgrounds, right? You look for community gathering places. And it didn't really occur to me when I was looking at property, there were none. And I know, Karlos, your organization's really been focused a lot on green space and the creation of green space. What do you think we need to be doing in terms of recreation, public outdoor space, gathering space, the types of parks you've been doing? How can we take that and expand it across the South Side?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my dissertation is actually on parks and green spaces and environmental justice on the South Side. And that's in part how we received the grant from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for People, Parks, and Power, with the Southside Coalition that we convened with the Unified Collective. And throughout that process, we gathered 250 surveys from Southside residents, specifically in terms of what they wanted to see in their parks. And the things that we heard was one, a park, a large, major, multi-amenity, multi-generational park in the inner core of the 45506 zip code. And the city and land bank is doing great work to try to create one for us right there off of the bike path. We also heard a lot of information about the trail right there on the bike path, and how it's underutilized, where some residents in that community might not even know that it's there, right? But that also says something deeply about the lack of affirmation of people thinking that certain amenities, natural amenities within the built environment, are for them, right? Even outsiders that are using a bike path, that becomes a line of demarcation for them to then turn their bike around and head back to Yellow Springs, right? Because of things are in terms of lack of perceptions of safety, wayfinding, lighting, security. And we hear that from the Southside residents themselves in terms of either perceived or real threats around safety at the parks. We hear about the need for increased amenities, programming, activity. One of the things that we were able to do through, GIS mapping was also map a number of the pocket parks and green spaces and community gardens to ensure that everybody's within walking distance of at least one park or green spaces. And I think, as a result of a lot of the labor of grassroots neighborhood-based organizations, we have a ton of neighborhood green spaces. And obviously you with the Rockman Heart Garden is one of those. And every year with the Southside in Bloom, I think that's one of the best opportunities that we have within the Southside to begin changing that perception that shows people how deeply we care and how deeply invested organizations and neighborhoods are. So we need to continue to look at that. But that, just like a number of other things, it's a real challenge because dollars are extremely finite. I always, in philanthropic investment, particularly in a city of this size. So, I always talk about how do we strike that appropriate balance at the intersection of mission and margin. And that's what we're looking at here. And so for us, there are real inequities in terms of our park district and where high quality parks are, but they also have serious financial issues, right? They just where, a levy was just not passed in very recent memory, right? So how do you hold institutions accountable but also walk alongside of them to get the investment that's needed for people that need it the most.
Yeah. So something that came up in one of our recent meetings about some of this development and work that was happening, you were talking about trying to create agreements that you would see benefit for residents that are already living there. Because a lot of the change that's going to happen is obviously moving some residents into the South Side. We have a lot of empty land. We have a lot of still quite a few number of vacant housing. But what can we see as we see that growth over the next 25 years? How can we ensure that's benefiting the residents who have been living there multi-generational? Because I've already been in that meeting, right? And I said I was living on the South Side like 22 years, and people are like, oh, that's nothing, right? 22 years. I've lived here 40, 45, 50 years, right? Mm-hmm. What can we do to make sure that the people that have been living in these neighborhoods long-term, one, are not forced out with gentrification, but beyond that they're benefiting, that the development that's happening is directly impacting and improving their lives?
Well, first and foremost, they have to be part of, the conversation. And, there's an old adage that says, if you're not at the table, then you're on the dinner menu. And a lot of times what we see, again, not unique to Springfield. I've been somebody that's been an institutional leader and currently an executive at one of Dayton's premier and largest anchor institutions in the region. And a lot of times, we create these processes for feedback, but the decision is already being made behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. Or by the time that it goes out to residents for a feedback, the decision is already made. Agreements are in place. They're already signed, or MOU agreements, or rights to purchase or first right of refusals are already cooked and baked. So this is just really procedural in nature. And this has happened over generations and decades, right? Which is why some of the skepticism of this project exists, because for residents, you all have did a phenomenal job of getting multi-sector partners, right? But for people that are not commonly in these rooms, or even has the privilege that we have right now to be occupying space and conversation right now, it's just leadership of the city, of the county, of the region. So the fact that it might be, organizational A on this project or organization B on this one is still a band of leadership, right? And that's how people look at it and perceive it and conceive it. So that's something that we really need to continue to do a better job, is bringing people to the table. But you're talking about community benefits agreements, which are specific to certain projects, that in order to come into this neighborhood to do this project, we want these certain types of provisions. And these are conversations that have happened, with those recent development projects, and people are afraid, right? When you're talking about, 60 duplexes, 120 units coming on the South Side. Are we able to put any provisions in place where if the developer was to eventually sell the properties, how do we ensure that the people living in those properties as renters have first right of refusals, right? Are we providing any type of home ownership and buyer education programs, right? Do we restrict the number of rental properties that they can sell off in one sale, right? Or are they wholesaling 120 properties, which could lead itself to a large developer, which could be more bad actors of housing on the South Side? So there's a multitude of things that can be done. And even in terms of, is there a certain number of green spaces of tree canopy that they have to plant with these developments? But again, I think the root of it is ensuring that residents are part of the conversation, and sometimes also recognizing that it's okay to walk away from a developer, particularly outside developer, if they're not willing to meet the needs of the community.
Yeah, and you were talking process, and I think we've had some discussions recently about what this process is going to look like moving forward, and it's even been evolving as we've been working on it, right? We had an idea of how we were going to move through this. We've had thousands of people involved so far, and eventually you get to a spot that you start to get these smaller core groups, and they just hammer out an issue. David, do you want to talk about how some of this process has changed and what you think, how these upcoming discussions are going to happen specifically on this pillar?
Yeah, so I think one of the real strengths of Springfield 2051 has been the outreach and the engagement. So as you said, thousands of people, right? And that wasn't thousands of people in one session. That was thousands of people across multiple sessions. So we've we must have done 40 or 50 individual listening sessions at high schools, in neighbourhoods, in different organisations. We've really tried hard to reach as many people as we can, gone out into the county and so on. And that has worked really well here. I think that has actually started to build the trust issue, which you talked about earlier, Karlos, and that takes time, right? But we've gone out and talked to people, allowed them to weigh in on it, and actually got really great data, right? So what we've decided to do now, and so this has now come together. So we've gathered all that input. It's come together into this focus around this sort of understanding about a preferred future and the vision and these what we call strategic pillars, which are the big focus areas we need to work on to stand that up. Our next big phase here is in Springfield 2051 is to think about, okay, well, what are the actions we need in each one of those focus areas? So what we're going to do is go back out to the community and get them to weigh in on actions, ideas, right? So some people love vision stuff. Some people, they just want to know, what do we need to do, right? Mm-hmm. So this is going to be their time, right? So we'll go out, get action ideas. We'll obviously synthesize those and come up with a series of key actions. And we're going to encourage people to think kind of big and bold and strategic. So these are not, there's a crack in the sidewalk on this neighbourhood. These are we want those broad brushstrokes that are going to be transformational. We'll get a series of actions across the pillars, and then we'll get the community to help prioritise those. That will hopefully give us a handful of very viable actions that we can build partnerships around and start to move forward on those. We can't do everything at once, so the roadmap will sort of lay out a sequencing of key actions. So I'm very excited actually to go back to a lot of these groups, including the Southside neighbourhood, talk about what we've discovered, talk about what's elevated to the top priority, which includes the revitalising Southside, and then start to say, okay, well, what are the actions we need to put in place? And we've hit on a number of those already, but let's hear what the community's got to say. Kevin, I think that home ownership is actually pivotal, right? From my own personal experience, my grandparents, they lived in a house for 60 years, right? They rented it for 30, right, from a church in Australia. And it was a working class area in Sydney. It was in Sydney, and Sydney grew around, and they bought their house. They had the opportunity to buy it. And then they lived in it as owners for 30 years. That house value just grew astronomically as the city grew around it, right? Mm-hmm. And as it improved, we were talking about that notion of as neighbourhoods improve, if you're a renter, you're on the wrong side of the equation because the value of the home you're in goes up, therefore its rental potential goes up a lot as well. So you keep getting pushed out. But if you're a homeowner, you're accruing benefit because that growth and improvement that's occurring around you impacts the value of your home. So I do think that home ownership is really important because that's the sort of castle or the safety point that people have where they can see benefit over time as the neighbourhood revitalises and as the community grows around them. But let's see what the community's got to say, right? So we'll go back out to the community, talk about actions, and then obviously bring those back together again and start to prioritise those.
So thank you. So Karlos, final question to you. In this process, when we've been asking people early on in the listening sessions, we ask them, what we think Springfield does well, in a way, what they're proud of when they look at this community. And almost everything that people have listed has happened in the last 25 years in this community, right? Even on the South Side. Like you look at the success stories on the South Side and there are things that have happened in the last 25 years. As we look forward, Springfield 2051 is not about 2051, right? It's about tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. It's building forward, but it's trying to set a long-term vision for where this community goes. What do you think, like if you can, let's hope we're all here, right, in 25 years and walking Springfield. What does a healthy, vibrant South Side look like to you in 2051?
Yeah, that's a very introspective question, and let me say I speak for myself and myself only on this. But again, it's vibrant parks, green spaces, small businesses at the neighborhood level, storefronts where people have walking access to the amenities that they need. It looks like strong community centers for youth, libraries that can anchor neighborhoods. It looks like recreational opportunities, right? It looks like increased home ownership, right? It looks like older adults and seniors being able to also age in place, which is an underspoken challenge when it comes to home ownership. People that already own their homes, how do we keep them in their homes? Or once they become on fixed incomes as retirees, but don't have the necessary financial resources to continuously improve or repair their homes. And so it looks like a place of pride where you have multi-generational folks that have been living here. You have newcomers. It's various social, economic, racial, and ethnic groups. How can we make the Southside represent the best of what Springfield and Clark County has to offer?
It's exciting. That's something I want to be a part of. So thank you both. For everyone watching and listening, this is not the end of the conversation. Now is really the point where this conversation is beginning on trying to find the solution. So stay tuned to Springfield2051.com. Look in your local newspaper, join the mailing list, get involved in these discussions because you are going to help shape this future. So we look forward to seeing you at those sessions. Thank you.
You have been listening to Let's Make History Together podcast. You can visit letsmakehistorytogether.com for more episodes. You may also check out Springfield2051.com to learn how you can get involved in the process of shaping our community's future. Special thanks to our guests and to you, our listeners and fellow community members. The music excerpt used for this podcast is by Johnny Lytle, one of Springfield's legendary music stars.